Business Trendsetter podcast, where we talk about trends and how to use them to grow your business. My name is Manny Turan.
And I'm Adam Hartung.
We are Spark Partners. We're here every week to talk about trends, how to look at them, how to dissect them, how to really go through a lot of the things that you see on the news outlets, and really take a hardline look at what it takes to identify trends, and then of course to align your business to them. And there's no doubt that social media platforms are the way to disseminate information on many levels. They've been around for 25, 30 years in different incarnations. I know, Adam, you had a fairly strong Twitter following in the past. And, for any business, they've got to be on some level of social media if they want to be out there in the world. And today we want to talk about three in particular, sort of compare and contrast some of the things that are happening to them and really how to look at trends alongside them. And of course, that is Pinterest, Twitter, which of course is now known as X, and Snapchat. So, Adam, I know that you and I had a pre-meeting here to discuss some of these things. What are your thoughts on these three in particular, and what kind of chance do they have to really continue the growth pattern that they've had over the past 3, 4, 5 years?
Well, what spurred my interest in talking about this was an article that you had found where there was a writer who did a comparison. He was talking about the value of Pinterest and the value of Snap. And he starts off there saying that Snap was worth 130 billion in the past. Now it's worth 16 billion, and Pinterest is worth 20, which is 25% more than Snap. And oh my gosh, isn't Pinterest doing great? And it looks like Twitter, it's private, so we can't really get any financial information on it, but maybe Twitter might be, they're catching up with Twitter, something along those lines. Man, that was a badly written article, really badly written article. And so what I really want to do is go in and say, how are these platforms doing, and what do they tell us about trends and what's meaningful? Because our user base could well be advertising on these platforms. I mean, a lot of small businesses do very, very well by placing ads on Twitter, Pinterest, Snapchat, and Instagram, which are the four pretty comparable platforms there. Facebook is also one, but I'm going to separate it off to the side on account of its immense size and the fact that it's more text-based, and these others use a lot more pictures. Okay, so maybe we should take a look at what's going on here with these platforms and kind of see what's happening. And so the first thing I did was look at, what's their sales? And the sales at Pinterest are 2.8 billion. Okay, the sales at Snapchat are 4.6 billion. So to start off with, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, Snapchat's got bigger revenues, 4.6 billion. That sounds pretty good. And then Twitter has revenues of about 4 billion, 4 to 4.5 billion. Instagram has revenues of 33.25 billion. So clearly there's one gorilla here. There's a huge gorilla, and that's Instagram, right? The second thing I took a look at is how much have these grown? Remember, I care about growth rates, not just absolute size, it's growth rate. Well, Pinterest has grown since I used my benchmark pre-pandemic 2018, and Pinterest has grown 3 times its size. It's tripled its size in that period, and that's a 40% per year growth rate. It turns out the Snapchat has tripled in revenues. It's also tripled in revenues with that same 40% per year growth rate. Instagram has gone up 6 times in size. In other words, it has doubled the growth rate of Pinterest and Snapchat, and so it's growing at 60% per year. So we've got 2 companies growing at 40% per year and one growing at 60% per year. So Instagram's still clearly far, far in the lead. They're the game to be caught if somebody kind of want to look at it that way. And it also tells you why the advertisers are using Instagram pretty heavily, is because it keeps attracting new users. It keeps bringing on more people. Yeah. Then the other two here, though, we're still kind of comparable here in terms of their growth rate and their ability to bring people onto the platform. So then I thought, well, let's take a look at what's happened with Twitter. Well, Twitter did grow between 2018 and 2023, but it went from about 3 billion to 4.5 billion. So right now, well, not right now, at the end of 22, right now, they're $1 billion shy of that. They've lost $1 billion revenue. We'll separate that.
Is that because of the whole X situation?
That's because of the Elon Musk ownership. Yeah. But coming up to the period 22, they went from 3 billion to 4.5 billion. That's only where these other companies tripled or 6 times their size. They grew 50%, right? So it's far less. It's 11.5% per year. So now you see that Twitter was already in trouble before Elon Musk bought it. It was unable to keep its revenue up. And we've actually talked about it in some old podcasts back. And back when I
Yep,
used
you
to
did.
write for Forbes magazine, I used to talk about the fact that when Jack Dorsey came back and took over the CEO of the company, he misguided the company by not focusing on revenues. And by not getting his head out there with the advertisers, Twitter kept becoming it was marginalized in terms of its market use, and it wasn't getting the ad revenue that it needed before Elon Musk bought it. Of course, Elon Musk bought it, and he seems to have no comprehension of the importance of revenue at all. Now, that's stupid. We all know better than that. Elon Musk drives revenue at Tesla. He pays attention there. At Solar City, he pays attention there. At SpaceX, he pays attention there, right? Starlink, he pays attention. He's always watching revenues. Yet, for some reason, he bought Twitter, and he seems to be all bound up in, I don't know, some religious war of some kind or something in his head, and he's just let the revenues fall off the cliff. I mean, revenues are now down to down 45% since he
Right.
bought it. Just since he bought it, revenues off
So like at
45%.
2018 numbers now.
Yeah, yeah, they're a little bit smaller than they were in 2018. So if we took a look at the number of users, we see that Instagram went from 1 billion to 2 billion users. So it doubled in size. Okay. Um, and so it's actually 2.3 billion today. Pinterest went from 240 million to 450 million. Okay. Snap went from 19 million to 380 million. So both Pinterest and Snap doubled in size. But that doubling is different because Pinterest was bigger in 2018, and so now it's 450 million compared to only 375 million for Snap. So Pinterest is bigger. And then what I have to do is say, what's the price to sales ratio? Well, the price to sales ratio for Meta is 6.5. The price to sales ratio for Pinterest is 5.7, and for Snapchat it's 4.2. Now, let's go through some other comparables. So that puts Pinterest at 5.7, Netflix is 5.5, Google or Alphabet is 5.4. Apple,
Why is that number? It might be important for our listeners and viewers to know. Why is that important? So why is that number so important?
as I always tell people, earnings are a picture of a snapshot picture in time of what happened in the past, and they do not reflect the future. You cannot ever project the future by looking at earnings. They all have no forward guidance to them, and they show no momentum of any kind because earnings can be manipulated. There's so many opportunities to determine when you want to incur your costs on your P&L. You can adjust your revenue recognition. You can change amortization depreciation schedules, how you account for interest expense, and then you can get an EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and it's kind of go and amortization. It's kind of go, wow, now you're removing very real costs, and you're not even putting those in the discussion. So all those earnings things tend to not be very valuable if you really want to figure out how good a company is. When you're looking at a company, you want to look and say, okay, how's its sales doing, and what's its sales growth rate? Then the better the growth rate is, the better their future markets look, the better the price to sales ratio. So, for example, Apple has a price to sales ratio of 7. Because why? Well, because it's in all these, it's got the cell phone business, it's got all those apps in the cell phone business, and people are looking at it saying there's going to be some new AI products coming out. They're looking at Apple possibly buying paying some big dollars, but getting into streaming on sports like NBA, NFL, or something like that. I think they already did a contract with the soccer league. They're looking and saying, here are these future opportunities for Apple and their growth rate, and so they've got a 7. Microsoft's is 12. 12. And the reason it's 12 is obvious. It's Azure, it's cloud services. They're out there competing with AWS. They're
Yeah.
just banging it home. They've been making investments in artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, like what's happening at Meta, is driving it forward. So if we get back to Instagram, I don't have a price to sales on Instagram, but I do for Meta, it's 6.5. And again, it's been resurrected in the last year. It was a much lower number, but it's at that high number because of people looking at the future and artificial intelligence. So now what we can say is, okay, there's something about the content and how they're taking it to market that are driving these differences. So I just talked about Microsoft. I just talked about Apple. Let's get back into Pinterest and Snap.
Okay.
What we know at Pinterest, we start looking at it as we say, oh, they are doing really, really well with teens all the way up to age 24, right? And then beyond age 24, they're doing good. They're doing very good. So they're doing really, really good in the younger and good above that. And what happens is their content is really, let me call it clean. Okay. The content that's on Pinterest is moderated, and they're driving for a content that's appropriate for all viewers. And so advertisers can look at that and say, oh, the chances of my ad being placed up against objectionable content, whether it's nudity, whether it's profanity, whether it's racism or anything, is the lowest on
Yeah.
Pinterest, one of the very lowest. Instagram also monitors much more tightly, and so it can get a better ratio as well. Snap, not so much. Snap does still deal with these OnlyFans type people that are coming onto Snap and they're
Yeah.
putting out the pictures, whereas Instagram's pulled that back a lot. They've shut a lot of those accounts down. They aren't letting pornography purveyors come out on Snap on Instagram and promote their OnlyFans and other pornographic materials. Snap hasn't gotten in front of that equation as good. I'm not saying they're terrible. I'm just saying they're not as good. And as a result, what we see is that Meta gets the best valuation of these platforms. Pinterest gets second. So now we're trending, we're taking a look at these numbers, we're starting to get some understanding, we're starting to say, can we determine a content difference? Then you can absolutely see a content difference at Twitter. Since Elon Musk has taken over, we know that racial epithets have grown up something like 10x. PBS channel did a 2-hour documentary on what's going on at Twitter since Musk bought it. I encourage people to watch it. It is long; it's 2 hours, and it doesn't tell the whole story. But what we do see is that the safeguards were taken off at Twitter. People could come on to Twitter and sort of say anything they wanted. People that have been very objectionable in the past were allowed access back onto the platform, and we start seeing all kinds of misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah.
It all just starts flooding back on the platform. Well, then the advertisers run away. So what we can do now is we can look at this and start to get a really good handle. And from our perspective, we say, okay, look, if you're going to do some advertising, stay away from Twitter. Your risks are higher there. Your opportunities of capturing a new audience are lower. Your costs might be lower, but I mean, you want to picture your company on the side of a garbage truck driving down the street. That's not going to give you the image you want. Probably a school bus, a metropolitan bus might. And we can think of a lot of ways you'd want your image on the side of a building or up on a big sign, but you wouldn't put on a garbage truck. And Twitter's quickly becoming the garbage truck of this industry. If you want to then separate out, you might say that you could do a little bit better cost ratio if you're doing with Snapchat, but you're going to take a little more risk and you're not going to get as many viewers. That's the biggest issue. You're dealing with a smaller viewership than you are over at Pinterest. So your best bang for the buck these days is Pinterest. If you want to be sure you really get people and you got the budget that's bigger, then you go for Instagram. So to some extent, it depends on your budget, but we can now look at this analysis and start saying, hey, where should I be advertising? And by looking at the trends and looking at where these companies have developed, how many users the revenues they generate, the growth rate they have, their ability to bring in new users, the speed they're doing that, and then the content and content moderation that they put forward, we're seeing how they best align with trends and therefore can produce the best for those of us that are listening to
Right.
the
So if
podcast.
we layer on top the prevailing trends that we talk about day in, day out, demographics and AI and the gig economy and so forth, if we look at them and against these three in particular, Twitter, X, Pinterest, and Snap, can we look forward from that and identify some areas or one that is a clear winner? Like you mentioned, Pinterest seems to be the best bang for the buck, but is that going to continue? Is that where we should be spending our advertising dollars if we want to really play the long game?
Well, I want to think of it a little bit like the auto industry in 1960. General Motors had a really big lead, Ford was second, and Chrysler was third. And so the battle was happening in there for about 15 years between Ford and Chrysler, who was going to be able to stand tall in the saddle. And that's where we are right now. Instagram is way out ahead. They're way, way out ahead. They're 4 times the number of users that these guys, 4 to 5 times the number of users that the other two have. And then they're generating the revenue, and their growth rate is even higher. So they say, where would I want to go? Would I want to go with number 3 or number 2? Well, what history has said is you're better off to vote for number 2. That in fact, whoever's number 2's got a bit of a lead. They're trying to catch number 1, and usually there's something they can tune into in terms of a market segment or a product offering that allows them to remain in a solid number 2 position. And then, because you don't want to go investing in number 3, you don't want to put your money in terms of an investment or your ad dollars as far as an investment in number 3. That would be difficult. And we'll consider another analogy would be the networks. For a long time, the television networks, when there were only 3 networks, and then PBS, and then we ended up with Fox on the general networks. Now, what we saw was that whoever led the networks was always out front in terms of the revenue generation, and it took a big change in content to change who was leading, right? And there's all these books written about broadcast TV and shows coming along and how it would switch sometimes from CBS to ABC. NBC was sort of the perpetual kid in third place and never really caught up with everybody else. And so you always see the valuations were higher at CBS and ABC than it was at NBC. And of course, those are all bought by somebody else now. So, typically you're going to be best off if you're advertising and you want to have a secure environment, you're going to be best off with number one. And then you take a look at number two. But again, it gets also into the content. And what I would say is that your content at Instagram, there's a lot more of it. So you might get lost. Your dollars aren't going to go as far. You're going to get lost of those 2 billion viewers. Will they see enough of your ads to remember it? You have to be really specific with your ad placement if you go to Instagram so that you don't waste your money.
Yeah.
Pinterest is a narrower target, and especially if you're in products that would go to the mass market, and you want an image that you don't have to worry about your brand or your icons or your product lines being diminished by being put next to difficult content, then you would be better off with Pinterest. But I would look for Snapchat to keep trying to fight the war. They're not going to give it up. And as an investor, my point of view is you always invest if you've got a big leader that's doing well and growing. Always invest in them.
Yeah.
10 years ago, I put money in Apple. I put money in these ones I talk about. And why do I make those decisions for myself? I make it because when you have a growing market and you have a leader in the growing market, then you have it's like that canoe in a river. They're out front, they're in the river, they got the best canoe, and they're really going fast and they're going forward with it. And so that's where you want to be because they're unlikely to ever get caught. As long as the market keeps growing and they keep growing at least as big as the market, then you're going to continue to do well in terms of an investment. So, Instagram from an investor point of view, which is Meta, is still the best bet. But if you're looking at it as an advertiser, then you have to take a look at your budget and the content you want to be placed against and the ability to reach your target market. But
Yeah.
you'll get more bang for your buck out of Pinterest these days.
I think a lot of marketing managers and business owners that have these decisions to make about where to put their attention, they have a bit of a myopic view. At least the folks that I've talked to, they look at where is a platform today, which is a snapshot, right? It's great today, but as things start to shift, as these trends start to play more and more of a part in the growth of these platforms, you really want to be more aligned with where things are going and where things are going to be in a year or two or five. I mean, obviously we don't know the future, but we have enough information from looking around that we can actually put a plan. We talk about scenario planning all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's still a drum beat we need to bang loudly with marketing managers, product managers, people that make these decisions, because look, things are going to change and you got to be ready for when they do.
And again, this gets back to that. Make sure you do your analysis. Don't just look at the headlines. There's a lot of people talking about Twitter/X, right? There's a lot of politicians talking about. There's all this screaming and yelling about what's free speech and what you should be allowed to do. And just ignore that and get back to the numbers. Is that driving eyeballs? Is it driving the eyeballs you want? And where's the trend? Right now, the trend is on content moderation. Advertisers are saying, I don't want unmoderated content. I don't want to advertise where there's unmoderated content, because I don't know how I'm going to be compared. I don't want my product up there against a very racist statement. And Twitter said, look, we're going to be the open platform. We are not going to moderate content. They're going against the trend, and they're not likely to do very well. And unless they make a big change, and I don't see that coming, right? So again, where you want to be is you want to be where the eyeballs are and where they're attracting more eyeballs. And then content moderation right now is where the market wants to be, regardless of what people are saying with their mouths, because that's where they're going and that's where they're actually visualizing. And they're not. Again, they have left in droves. They have left Twitter. They are not going there. It's not just that they've lost growth. We're talking about 50% declines in the size of the user base at Twitter. And the ones that are remaining are often putting up content that is not for the mass market. And it is not moderated. So that's where you find more misrepresentations and other problems with the content.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there's another topic that we discussed regarding this idea of homeschooling, right?
Yeah.
And I've got two boys in high school, and one's going to be off to college very soon, and so public schools, private schools, homeschools, those are all things that have been at play for a while now. I mean, when I grew up, almost everybody went to the public high school. Very few went to private, or even less went to homeschool. So I know we've got some interesting data to share with us regarding what's happening with homeschooling.
Yeah, I was teed off on this idea from an article in the New York Times, by the way. So I need to give credit to the source, which was the New York Times. And what they did was they pulled data from across the country on schools and kids going to school. Also, I want to be really clear. They pulled all the states and the District of Columbia, but 19 states did not collect data. And so this data, I'm going to talk about it as if it represents the entire U.S., but I do want people to know there were 19 states that did not present the data at all. But the net of it was, and this is the part that I think was really fascinating, is that since the pandemic in 2017, homeschooling has grown at 50% per year. 50% per year.
Wow.
Right? So while it has grown at 50% per year, the growth of private schooling has gone 7% overall, and public schooling has lost 4% of its students. So I'm sorry, 7% per year and 4% per year on both of those. So children going to public education is a smaller group. There's a shift. Some of those went into private education, but then a number of them have gone into homeschooling. So I wanted to take a look at these numbers, and out of 390 school districts, there are 390 school districts in the United States in which 10% of the students are homeschooled. 1 out of 10 are homeschooled. That caught my attention. I'm saying, hey, this is pretty broadband. And digging into it, there's no pattern to that. Like one is in the Bronx and one is in this tiny town in South Dakota. I can't look around to the data and say, oh, it's people in small towns or people in big cities and people running away from the district in Las Vegas or something like that. No, that pattern doesn't emerge at all. It turns out that it's very, very widespread and it's in a number of areas. So six states. Now, my first assumption, my first thought was, I bet it's places where people are a bit more progressive. And I thought that because for a number of years now, for the last 15 years, it's been true that admissions to elite schools, such as Harvard, Princeton, Yale, the Ivy Leagues, as well as the elite schools on the West Coast and in the Midwest, Northwestern, University of Chicago, Stanford, those schools, they have, if you looked at where the people went to high school, there was a disproportionate number of homeschooled people. And looking into those numbers, what often happened was very wealthy people, not very wealthy, people that had the means that they could homeschool their children. They had a parent often that stayed home, or they hired a tutor to come to the house every day. And that child got perfect education, right? It was designed for them. And so therefore they did very well in their testing, like the SAT test, and they were better positioned to go into the elite schools. So I'm thinking, oh, so this is a pattern of people spending money to get into the elite schools. I found out something very different. There were 6 states in which they had doubled the number of students that were homeschooled. 6. They were California, New York, District of Columbia, Rhode Island. Now I'm going down I'm thinking, oh, this is the elites. This is the elites. The next 2 were South Dakota and Tennessee. Now that doesn't fit my pattern, right? That doesn't fit my assumption. But I looked then at the states that grew at 50 to 100%. So they didn't double, but they got in that range of 50 to 100, and there were 8. And so now let's do it again. Hawaii, Massachusetts, that's pretty liberal, that's progressive. Pennsylvania and Ohio, much more midstream, battlefield states, right? Then Florida, Kentucky, Kansas, and Louisiana. Those are rock red states, all of them rock red. Man, so now I'm like, okay, wow, this is pretty, what's going on? And then there were 11 states that had 25 to 50% growth. Washington, Wisconsin, Minnesota, those might be considered battleground to perhaps progressive. Vermont might be progressive. But then New Hampshire, which has traditionally been very, very right wing, and then a red state, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Arkansas, South Carolina, and Virginia. So there's no pattern here to say that it's the elites. Clearly, it's not coming off that way, right? And so as we started digging into it some more, we started finding out that there were parents that were just simply saying, I'm at odds with the school board. I'm at odds with the teachers. And we're hearing this all the time, right? We're hearing that, it's in the popular news all the time about parents being mad going to school boards. There's books being banned, and all these arguments are going on about education. And the more I'm looking into it, the more I'm seeing that there are people who, yes, will say, I want my child to get a superb education. I will pay for it either by a parent staying at home or by hiring somebody to do it. Then there are people that are saying, I'm just tired of it. I don't want my kid in that environment. Now, this is fascinating because what they're doing is when you go homeschooling, there's no regulation. Like there's no program. It's not like you call up school district and say, "Hey, tell me what books to buy and send them to
Right.
my kid." But when I give them tests, can I send them to the teacher to evaluate? No, I mean you just said I want to go homeschooling, and you're on your own. So it's unregulated. So then we get to the final thing that really got my attention. What percentage of students in these states, other than 19, the ones that we've got, what percentage of students, as we look across the numbers, what percentage do you think are homeschooled?
Of the ones
It's
you
not
just
enough a lot,
mentioned.
but a very small base. You can get high percentage gains on tiny bases.
I don't know, 8%, 6%.
So I thought it was going to be like zero point 0.5 or zero point 0.6. But according to the LA Times, and they tried to move the numbers around, do the best they could. There's about 2.5 million homeschooled children today. Okay, the total school population of public schools is 75. That's 3.3%. Now, I look at that and that shocks me because if we go back to the August 26th podcast that we did on EV and EV adoption, we did a podcast on tipping points. And we said that most people think a tipping point happens at 50%, but actually tipping points occur much earlier than that, anywhere in the range of 5 to 9. You get to this point, there's enough people. And so when I think about the 390 school districts that have 1 out of 10, those are some pretty big numbers. That's a bunch of people in the school district saying, "I'm not going to send my kid to that school." Those school districts need to know much more what's going on. But now we need to think about this as a society. We got 3.5% of kids that are being homeschooled with no regulation, no programming effort to manage that, nobody taking care of it. And is this going to work out well, or is it not going to work out well? At this point, I'm pretty, like I said, it's not people getting an elite education anymore. So if it's parents saying, I'm tired of what they consider possibly BS, I don't want my kid to go deal with that, are they able to provide an adequate K-12 educational experience for their children? And we don't know because there's no monitoring. Nobody's going in these homes. Nobody's doing testing. Nobody's doing overtime testing to try to say what's the performance, the academic performance of these at-home school children. We have no data. So, from a trend perspective, I think that people need to really pay attention to this. I would say this is a tremendous business opportunity. It's an opportunity for people to understand education to get out there and start offering some programs and saying, here's a fifth grade program for students in Kansas. And here's
Mm-hmm.
how you can administer it using your home PC, and here's the testing, and then here's how you can evaluate month by month if they're keeping up with the average in your state. There's all kinds of things you could do to help this trend move along. I think this is now a tremendous opportunity. So just an example of what you and I do, Manny, I wanted to bring forward for our listeners as to how you could catch a hold of an article, something about the growth of homeschooling, and start saying, okay, is this a trend, and should I pay attention? At this point, it's definitely a trend. It's definitely growing, and it's halfway or more towards reaching a tipping point, which means that then once it gets there, we can expect these numbers to jump up to, as I said, 10, 15, 20%
Yeah,
of people being homeschooled. If you get a piece of that action, that could be a pretty good business opportunity.
for
And
sure.
on top of that, let me say why I think it's business opportunity is many states, especially these states that trend towards Republican legislatures, are now going with vouchers. And they're saying if you don't want your kid to go to public school, we'll give you an $8,000 voucher so that you can send your kid somewhere else. A lot of the politicians say they're doing this so the kids can go to say private school, but a lot of parents could say, "Oh, if I don't send Manny to school, I get 8K." They'll take it. Now the question is, what kind of parents are these? Are they going to spend the 8K on education, or are they going to say that's an extra 8K in my pocket? And Manny, we'll see what kind of education you get.
Right.
I mean, there's vouchers, and I know in your home state of Arizona, it's a hot topic right now. It's up in front of the legislature whether you're going to provide these $8,000 vouchers. It's something going across the nation. It's sweeping across. If that gets voted into a lot of states, then that's going to amplify this trend
Right.
because it's going to throw money at it.
Well, I like the way that you went through and on a topic like homeschooling, kind of random, right? But it does have major implications. It has major financial as well as personal and familiar implications. How you can dissect it, how you can look at where the patterns are, and like you said, you couldn't identify any clear patterns, right? It was left wing, right wing, it was all over the place, and so based on that, I think that that was a good exercise to understand how, even though there's no generalized pattern, there could be some things you derive, like you said, either the elites or people that are just fed up with the school board, the school systems as they are.
Well, thanks a lot, Manny. I hope people out there understand more what you and I do. We get asked, we talk a lot about general things, but we can look specifically at markets and investments and come up with some pretty clear guidelines for where people ought to put their money. You're not going to grow if you don't put your money into things that grow, and we can help guide that money the place it needs to be. So I think a couple of opportunities here we identified that shared with people, give them an example of the kind of work that we do and how trendcasters, or why trendcasters like us are important.
Yeah, very well said, Adam. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Cheers.